So welcome back, everybody, to another webinar hosted from Princeton, available for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Stephen Redding with us, my colleague here at Princeton. Hi, Steve. Great having you.
Hi, Markus.
Steve,
thanks a lot.
Good to have you. Great to have you on this webinar series. Steve will talk about pandemics and the future of globalization. So before we start, I would like to summarize the poll results you participated in the Zoom call. And then I will give some opening remarks before Steve takes over. So let me just, for the poll results, Steve asked, does increased globalization increase the likelihood of pandemics, decrease, or has no effect? And actually 82% think it increased, 6% think it decreases it, and has no effect as 13%. The second question was, will social distancing during the COVID pandemic increase the ratio to trade to GDP or decrease it or has no effect? And the answers are 13, 45, and 43%. So mostly decrease or has no effect. And the third question is, how will it look at after the COVID crisis is over, in the aftermath? Will there be increased globalization, reduced globalization, or no change? And the results are 15, 68, and 17%. So the majority thinks reduced globalization big time. Now with this, let me start with a talk I heard yesterday at ECB Sintra by Paul Antras, and he made the case there will not be any deglobalization, there will be globalization. So I call this the Paul Antras hypothesis. So you see here on the figure, you see how the globalization went up, trade activity went up, but then it slowed down, but it's not really going down. And the argument is, technology is still pushing for more globalization, robotics, 3D printing, digitalization, blockchains. That's essentially pushing further for more globalization. The only force, or the forces which push against it, is politics, and it's trade wars and driven by inequalities, essentially, which trade has enhanced within the advanced economies. That's the driver to that. And in terms of reshoring, will there be more reshoring? And it's quite a huge fixed cost to do the reshoring. So he was skeptical about this as well. The next thing, looking at what happened after COVID, or what caused, how the impact of COVID on trade. You see a huge decline going, but quite a recovery again in trading activity. And you look at different products, you see most of the decline was in cars, but it came back as well quite dramatically. So it's, it halted the trade, COVID, but there was already a fast recovery. And, and some argument is that, the COVID infection, of course, made it slower, but we also learned a lot that, it's not population density. Like in New York City, there's fewer cases now than in North Dakota. And North Dakota is probably family size matters much more. That's a point Paul Krugman made last week at the IMF. So let me say one thing which I think will probably change, and which I would like to emphasize, is when I draw one connection to the COVID crisis, I think the word which comes to my mind is resilience. So before that, outsourcing, it was all about cost minimization. Now everything is focused on resilience. So in other words, we had this just-in-time, cheap way to save efficiency gains and all this. Now we say, just in case, we need some backup. And I have two pictures here. One is, saving money. It's like a little pig where you save your money in. Or you have this resilient poly toy. I don't know how it's called in English. It's a Stehaufmännchen in German, which you push it over, it always comes back up. So it's very resilient. And I think that's very important. So rather than having one supplier from the cheapest country where you can outsource the cheapest, you might want to have two or three suppliers, dual sourcing, where you get from different continents, ideally, different suppliers. And this way, if a pandemic brings out or any other risk comes, you have always some backup. So just in case, if something goes wrong. Let me conclude my remarks with coming back to some paper I wrote earlier with Harold James and Raj Doshi. How does great powers compete economically in the space of globalization? And as I mentioned earlier, there are some nice analogies between Imperial Germany in the 19th century competing with a rising power, competing with the UK, and what you see now between China and the United States. And you have very similar analogies. Germany, the German Empire tried to build a railroad from Berlin all the way to Baghdad. If you go to Istanbul, you still see the train stations there. And that's, and of course the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is very, very similar. You have a lot of weaponization of the dollar, a lot of competition with the finance. You have this digital money moving in. So China just announced the digital RMB, renminbi. There's, of course, on the US side, Libra and other digital currencies coming up. There's a lot of space in the finance space. And there's what will be very, very important will be standard setting. Who is setting the standards for the new technologies? When the US was not able to set the standard for mobile phones, the Europeans established the GSM standard, and this became the global standard. Who is setting the standard for the 5G now? And all these new technologies we will be facing, having the edge to set the standard will be really key advantage down the road. And then there's, of course, there will be new borders, not only physical borders like country size, there will be new borders coming up, which are digital borders, which are regulated more by privacy considerations, because a lot of data and information technology will be the key. But I give now the floor to Steve, because he will talk much more how the globalization will be shaped by pandemics and how globalization shapes the pandemics, the back and forth between the two, and we will learn a lot. He's joined to work with Paul Antras and also with another one of my colleagues, Esteban, who was in the webinar series already, Esteban Rossi-Hansberg. So Steve, the floor is yours. I pass on the mic to you virtually.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen now?
Perfect.
Perfect, great. Well, thank you very much, Markus, for the invitation to participate today. Wonderful opportunity and a great introduction there, anticipating many of the themes that I was going to speak about later. What I wanted to do today is talk about some joint work with two of my colleagues, Paul Antras at Harvard, who Markus mentioned a moment ago, and Esteban Rossi-Hansberg here at Princeton, who Markus also just mentioned. And I'd like to talk about pandemics and the future of globalization. And so what's the motivation for this work? Well, as we all know, globalization and pandemics have been closely intertwined throughout human history. So for example, the Black Death arrived in Europe in October 1347, when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. And quarantine comes from the Italian word for the 40-day isolation period of ships and their crews developed during the Black Death pandemic. And then much more recently, the first documented human-to-human COVID-19 cases in Europe actually occurred in Starnberg, Germany, where a local car parts supplier, Webasto, was organizing a training session with a Chinese colleague from Wuhan in China. So the direct example of where business travel, people traveling as a result of trade, played a key role in disseminating the COVID-19 infection. And this is not just an isolated example. There are many other documented cases where business travel was absolutely central to the dissemination of the disease. For example, there's a kind of very famous Biogen conference in Boston, which acted as a super spreader event. And so what we're interested in thinking about is what is the relationship between globalization, movements of goods and movements of people between countries, and pandemics. And how does this relationship flow in two directions? On the one hand, does globalization make societies more vulnerable to pandemics? So globalization causing greater pandemics. And as we saw in the answers of the poll just a moment ago, most people kind of agree with that statement that globalization will make the world more vulnerable to pandemics. And then on the other hand, how do pandemics feed back to influence the volume and pattern of trade and the future of globalization? And there again, as we saw in the poll, there is a little bit more uncertain as to how things are going to develop. And so we're interested in really trying to understand these two-way interactions, from globalization to pandemics and from pandemics to globalization. And so my talk today is really going to be sort of a talk of two halves. In the first half of the talk, I'm really going to kind of drill down and try to think conceptually about that interaction, try to understand that two-way relationship. And then in the second part of the talk, I'll step back and try to place pandemics in the broader history of the evolution of globalization in recent decades, touching on some of the themes that Markus started with in his introductory remarks. And so what I'm going to do now is going to dive in and think a little bit conceptually about how globalization and pandemics influence one another. And then later on, I'll zoom out and take this sort of longer view of the future of globalization. So diving straight into globalization and pandemics. So as we're all familiar with by now, the sort of standard framework for thinking about pandemics such as COVID-19 is the susceptible, infected, recovered model, the SIR model. And so I just wanted to sort of begin by just flagging a couple of elements of that framework, and then we'll sort of see how it's influenced by globalization. So what is that framework? Well, we're going to have the population is going to be divided into the fraction of people who are susceptible, who are sort of healthy and haven't yet been infected, the fraction of, and that's S, the susceptibles, the fraction of the population who are infected, I, who've got the disease, and then the fraction of the population who are recovered, who've been infected, they've recovered from the disease. And then typically for most infectious diseases, we either think that once people are recovered, they become immune, or unfortunately, a fraction of them might die as a result of the illness. Okay, and so we're sort of interested in what drives the evolution of this pandemic. And so the standard way of thinking about this is to begin with, everybody starts out as susceptible, they're healthy, they haven't been infected yet. And then we consider a small initial infection as a result of the disease, for example, jumping from animals to humans. And we're interested in the circumstances under which that leads to a pandemic. And so what does this framework tell us determines that? Well, firstly, we have to think about the chance that subsequent people become infected. And so what's going to determine the flow of people from this initially healthy state where everybody is healthy into the infected state? Well, that's going to depend upon the fraction who are currently healthy, who are susceptible S, times the fraction who get infected. And initially, there's just this initial small infection as a result of the disease crossing over to humans. So it's the probability someone's susceptible, the probability they meet someone who's infected, so S times I, and then also the probability the disease is transmitted between them once they meet one another. And that's referred to as this transmission rate in the health literature, beta, the chance that you actually get infected if you meet somebody who has the disease. And so that's going to determine the flow from healthy people into infected people. Once people become infected, what happens then? Well, there's going to be a constant recovery rate, gamma, which is referred to as a recovery rate here. And so a constant fraction of people will gradually recover at this fraction gamma. And that's determined by things like the nature of the illness, how long the disease takes to work itself out. And then once you're recovered, you're either going to become immune or unfortunately, a fraction of people may die as a result of the illness. And then what I do today, I'm mostly going to think about the case where we don't have a vaccine for the disease. But I'll illustrate some sort of interesting implications of our framework for thinking about vaccine policy as we go through the talk. And so when does the pandemic take off? Well, as you all know, that's going to be summarized by this R0 number, which we're all talking about these days. So what is R0? It's just the ratio of the transmission rate, the chance you get the disease if you meet somebody who already has it, divided by the recovery rate, the speed with which people move out of being infected into the recovered state. And if that R0 is strictly greater than 1, then even if we just have a small initial infection, we're going to have an epidemic as a result of this disease. And so that's sort of summarized here in this figure here, which I think is very kind of insightful for thinking about how an epidemic like COVID-19 works itself out. So what does this figure show? On the horizontal axis here, we've got the fraction of people who are susceptible, who are healthy, who haven't been infected yet. And on the vertical axis, we've got the percentage of people who are infected at any point in time. Initially, everybody is healthy. They haven't been infected yet. 100% of people are susceptible. We have a small initial amount of infections. What happens? Well, if R0 is bigger than 1, we have our epidemic. And so gradually, the fraction of the population who are healthy declines as people become infected. Infections start to rise for a while because R0 is bigger than 1. But as infections rise, the share of people who are still healthier is getting smaller and smaller. And so that's reducing the transmission of the disease, because remember, that depends upon the share who are healthy, who haven't yet been infected, times the share who are infected. So as the share of susceptibles declines, that's reducing the speed with which people are getting infected, because there are fewer healthy people to become infected. And then eventually we get to this herd immunity threshold, at which R0, that ratio of the transmission rate to the recovery rate, falls below 1. And from that point onwards, infections start to decline until eventually we get to a point at which the illness has worked itself out. And obviously this is the case where there's no lockdown, there's no change in government policy. and we get this single wave with this big peak of infections, and eventually the disease works itself out. And obviously lockdowns are trying to avoid us getting to this very high peak of infections, which might strain the health system and put pressure on limited resources.
Steve, there's a question from Daisy Payne. She would like to know, COVID, you might be reinfected. You might not be immune after having it had once. How would the analysis, can you translate, how would the analysis still work, or would it change dramatically in your? Absolutely,
so great question. Yes, that's definitely a possibility, and there's quite a large epidemiological literature looking at that. That's going to tend to make the pandemic worse if some people can become reinfected, if immunity is not guaranteed. Because if we go back to our flow diagram here, if once you've had the illness and you recovered, you don't become immune, but you become susceptible again, then you go back into the pool of people who can potentially become infected again. And so that's going to sort of prolong the disease and make it worse and to occur over a longer period. And then obviously if we develop a vaccine, that will have the opposite effect of limiting the disease as we're gradually able to vaccinate people. The jury's sort of still out on the possibility of becoming infected more than once with COVID-19. Most of what I do today, I'm going to consider this sort of simple case when you can't become reinfected. But as we go through, I'll kind of mention along the way how allowing for a reinfection would influence things. It's a great question.
There's another question, a quick one. Sergio Guimarães, he asks, the model, what you've shown, it shows like there's a one wave, but there might be a second or third wave. Will you elaborate? Will you go into that later on as well?
Yeah, great question. So that's exactly something that I'm going to be looking at. So if you just have a single economy, which is really this sort of classic SIR model we're just looking at here, if you don't have a government policy like a lockdown, you can only ever have a single wave. But one of the key insights of our framework is actually going to be when you open your economy up, it's possible to generate multiple waves because of the interactions between countries, because of movements of goods and people between countries. And so that sort of possibility for multiple waves is going to be one of the key new insights of bringing globalization into the picture. And so that's a great question, sort of anticipating what I'm going on to right now. And so the kind of big question we're interested in is, how does this standard model of disease dynamics, how is it affected by globalization? And so what we do in our work is we try to develop a conceptual framework to think about that. And so we develop a framework where we model both international trade and disease dynamics as stemming from an underlying model of human interactions. Okay, and so let me just sort of briefly summarize that, and then I'll tease out some of the implications, including this multiple wave point, which we were just discussing. So we're now going to depart from the previous model by thinking about a setting where we have a world of more than one country. And so in the simplest case, we've got two countries or two locations which can trade with one another. Although pretty much everything I say today is very easy to consider many more countries, it just makes things more complicated. And so to sort of distill the key insights, I'm going to try and keep things as simple as possible by thinking of this world of two countries. In each country, there are many households. And what these households do is they produce some things, they produce some goods or services, and they also consume some things. They consume some goods and services. And households consume things they produce themselves, and they also consume the goods produced by other households. And so this is sort of here sort of an abstract framework where the household and the firm are sort of the same thing, just to, again, to try to keep things as simple as possible and illustrate the key insights. And so in particular, to connect with our model of disease dynamics, we're going to think about each household consisting of two people. There's going to be a buyer who leaves the household and goes out to purchase goods and services from other households. And there's going to be a supplier who produces the goods and services manufactured or provided by the household itself. And so what this is a sort of metaphor that as individuals, as people in the economy, we go out into the world and we produce some things, and then we also consume some things produced by other people. And importantly, we consume things produced by other households or other firms in our own economy, but we also consume goods and services produced by other firms and other households abroad. And so here we've got both of those types of interactions. And we're sort of thinking about them separately as a buyer and a supplier within the household. The buyer's going out and purchasing things from other people. The supplier is selling things to other people. But that's really just a simplifying device for thinking about the fact that we're all producers and consumers in the things we do during our everyday lives. And in particular, what households are going to do is they're going to choose how intensively to interact with other households at home in their own economy, and how intensively they interact with other households in other economies. And so because of this sort of evidence I discussed earlier of the role of trade in transmitting disease through business travel, we're going to think about our two countries or our two locations as really being nations, and the trade between them being international trade. Although much of what I'm talking about today, you could also think about our two locations as, for example, North Dakota and New Jersey, to connect with the example that Markus mentioned earlier, or as different neighborhoods within a city that again interact with one another, and people in those neighborhoods are choosing how much to consume from the local neighborhood, from the own neighborhood, and how much to consume from other neighborhoods. The key thing is just going to be that these locations are connected to one another through flows of people and flows of goods. So what happens when I go out there and I interact with other households and I consume their goods and services? Well, just like in the single economy disease model we just started with, there's going to be some probability you get infected. And that probability is going to depend upon the local health environment, how dense economic activity is, social norms, about how people interact with one another. And so there's going to be some disease environment alpha I in country I, and a disease environment alpha J in another country J. And to sort of trace this way that globalization influences pandemics, I'm going to begin with a sort of very simple case where this disease doesn't cause deaths, and people aren't even aware that there's a threat of being infected when they interact with others. And so that's really going to sort of isolate the pure way in which globalization influences the dynamics of the disease, because people don't respond to the threat of the disease in any way. And so the only way trade and interactions between people matter is because they affect the dynamics of the disease. And then later on, I'll relax that assumption and I'll allow agents to become aware of the fact that when they interact with others, they're at risk of being infected, and there's some chance that they will die as a result of the disease. And as you'll see, that's going to be really important, and it's going to deliver a number of kind of nice insights about how globalization influences the dynamics of the disease. And so how does that change things in our framework? Well, it's going to be very similar to before, except that now when we think about, we start with everybody healthy, not having the disease, and then we consider a small initial infection in one of the countries in the world. It can be in any country around the world. How is the disease dynamics evolve now in the setting with two countries? Well, now you can get infected from interactions at home. And that can either be because you go out and you buy things from other households in your home location, or because other households come to you and buy goods and services from you. And so that's why there's a two there, because you can either be going and buying from other households domestically, or you can be selling to other households domestically. And so there are now going to be some transitions from being healthy to being infected domestically within your own country. And crucially, because we've got globalization, we've got interactions between these locations, you can get transactions because you go abroad into the foreign country's disease environment, or you can get infections because foreign people come to your location and they bring the disease with them. And so they're going to be the key new elements of globalization, that you can now experience infections either because you go to another location where there's some people are infected, or because people from that other location come to you. And so what are the key insights of that? Well, they're going to be really quite powerful, and they're going to relate to the poll that Markus started with. Our first insight is that by blending globalization and a model of disease dynamics, we see that there's a very, very strong epidemiological externality between countries. What do I mean by that? I mean that in the open economy, whether a pandemic occurs depends upon the country that has the worst disease environment. So let's think of these two locations as New Jersey and North Dakota. It doesn't matter how good the disease environment is in New Jersey. It could be that New Jersey has a really great disease environment, such that if it were a closed economy, if it were the only location in the world, there would be no pandemic because R0 would be less than 1. But if there's even a little bit of trade with another location like North Dakota, which has a very unhealthy disease environment, it has an R0 bigger than 1 in the closed economy, then even a tiny amount of trade will cause New Jersey to be part of a global pandemic between the two locations. There's a very strong disease externality between the locations. And so that's really, really relevant today. Someone asked a question about multiple waves. You'll see that in a second. It's also very relevant to thinking about vaccine policy, because it kind of suggests it's really important to get the vaccines out into the location with the worst disease environment. connecting with our, and this figure just illustrates that.
Can I ask another question? Do you allow to have some border closings and some partial border closings to make a continuous variable of that? Or?
Great question. So that's exactly what I'm going to do right now.
Oh, okay.
So let's think about that case. So Markus is ahead of me. He's anticipating. So that result I held there is true even with a limited interactions between the countries. As long as there's some degree of interaction between them, what I said will be true. It comes down to the sort of lowest common denominator. Whether there's a pandemic depends upon the disease environment in the country with the worst disease environment. And then moving to Markus's question, well, what happens if you either reduce, impose barriers to trade or movements of people between locations? Can you eliminate the pandemic by imposing border barriers, by restricting flows of people? And so related to our poll earlier, it's actually very, very subtle. On the one hand, sometimes globalization can actually make the pandemic worse. It can create a pandemic and it can make the pandemic worse when it occurs. What's a very easy way of seeing that? Well, a very easy way of seeing that is, let's think about if we were to reduce barriers to flows of people and goods between locations. So there's more business travel, there are more flows of people between locations. What is that going to do? Well, as I make trading with other locations less costly, I'm going to start having more interactions internationally and less interactions at home, because I've made it relatively more attractive to interact abroad by lowering these barriers to foreign interactions. If the two locations are the same as one another, that lowering of barriers to foreign interactions, it turns out also increases the total number of interactions. So in other words, even though domestic interactions go down a little bit because it's now cheaper to interact abroad, nevertheless, they only go down a little bit. And so the total number of interactions rises. And so globalization increases the overall volume of interactions. And so it's perhaps not surprising that that makes pandemics more likely. And to answer Markus's question, that's exactly what you see in these two figures down here. What do they show? Well, they show the number of people who get infected at some point during a pandemic and who are recovered at the end of that pandemic. That's on the vertical axis. What's on the horizontal axis? Well, in the left panel, these are barriers to flows of goods, which reduce business travel and hence flows of people between locations. And on the right panel, we've got a reduction. As we get closer to 1, we're reducing barriers to movements of people. And so what do we see in this figure? Well, if we start out with very high barriers to people, R0 is less than 1, and there's no pandemic in this world economy of these two locations. But as we reduce barriers to flows of goods or flows of people, as long as these two countries are very similar to one another, we're going to have a pandemic in both countries. Okay, so both countries, as globalization links these countries together, it makes it more likely that a pandemic occurs. As soon as R0 rises above 1, we reduce these frictions to flows of people and goods. R0 rises, and as soon as it rises above 1, we get a pandemic in both locations. And the lower the barriers to movements of people and movements of goods, the worse the pandemic in the two locations. But it's actually not that subtle relating to our poll. So our poll at the beginning had this sort of straightforward intuition, which was my intuition starting on the research, that globalization would make pandemics worse. But it's actually not that simple. It's actually much more subtle than that. It's also possible, as we suggested in the poll earlier, that more globalization can actually prevent pandemics, and it can make them less bad when they do occur. So what's going on here? How can this situation arise? Well, this situation can arise when our two countries, in our example, or our two locations, have very different disease environments with one another. Okay, so think about New Jersey and North Dakota, very different disease environments from one another. What happens if we reduce barriers to flows of people and goods between those two locations? It's actually possible we can make pandemics less bad and less likely to occur. Why does that occur? Well, when I reduce barriers to interactions between the two locations, people in North Dakota, instead of staying at home in North Dakota, they're going to, where the disease environment is very bad, they're now going to spend more time in New Jersey, where the disease environment is better, because I've reduced the frictions to interacting with people in New Jersey. So for North Dakota, more people are spending time out of the bad disease environment and going and spending time in New Jersey, where the disease environment is much better. Obviously, that's going to be good news for North Dakota, because there are now going to be fewer infections because people who live in North Dakota are spending more time in New Jersey. And that's what you see in this figure here, that the country with the bad disease environment, as we reduce barriers to flows of goods or barriers to flows of people, infections start to decline as we liberalize. perhaps more surprisingly, that can even be good for New Jersey. Okay, so that's very surprising, because in this situation, when I reduce barriers between New Jersey and North Dakota, the people from North Dakota, where the disease environment is bad, are spending more time in New Jersey. So you might think, well, doesn't that make infections in New Jersey worse? And that's possible for a while here, as you see, as you reduce barriers to flows of goods or barriers to flows of people, for a while, infections do start to increase in New Jersey. But it's also possible, as you keep reducing barriers, it's possible that infections in New Jersey might actually decline as well. And so more globalization might be good for both the countries or both the locations. Why does that happen? Well, again, the people from New Jersey, for the people from North Dakota are spending more time in New Jersey. And if they spend enough time there, you can eliminate the pandemic in the global economy because of New Jersey's very good disease environment. Or you can make the pandemic less bad when it occurs because people spend more of their time in New Jersey. So a very, very kind of subtle implication. Globalization can sometimes be bad because it increases the overall volume of interactions, and interactions tend to spread disease. But if the two countries are very different from one another, it can be true that more globalization can actually make the pandemic less bad, and can yet also sometimes deliver welfare gains from trade. So it can generate gains from international trade.
Steve, there are three questions actually from Robert Owen and John Lau and Andrea Moro. They would like you to make a case why this model, why if you have international containers moving from China to the US, bring disease, wasn't it more a model of tourism or where people really meet? Or, you know, why do they have to meet in the first place if you just ship a container from China?
Great question. So great question. So in our model, we have trade involves an element of business travel, and that's partly motivated by the evidence I started with, that there's a lot of strong evidence that trade does involve a degree of business travel. The key thing that's really important for the model is that there are flows of people between locations that follow a gravity equation. And it turns out that that feature of the data is extremely strong. So gravity equations hold for trade flows. They also hold for migration flows. They hold for tourism. They hold for commuting flows. They hold for many, many kinds of interactions between locations. And so as long as you're in a setting where interactions between locations follow a gravity equation feature. So what does a gravity equation mean? It means that the more distant these locations are from one another, the less they interact with one another. Like planets in Newtonian gravitation, they attract one another less strongly, so there are fewer interactions between them. And then the bigger the size of the two locations, the greater the product of their masses, the more they interact with one another. And that's really all you need for these results that I've been just flowing down here. And it's true, as in Robert's question, that the way we've modeled things, the flows of goods and the flows of people go together. You know, that's really just for simplicity, and because there's a lot of evidence that trade involves a degree of business travel. And we have all these examples where business travel was very consequential for the spread of COVID-19. But all you really need are some flows of people between locations. And as Robert pointed out, for some activities, we maybe had to ship cars on a container, and so there are relatively few people people interactions involved. For other kinds of interactions, like for sort of research and development, for sophisticated electronic industries, there may be many, many more personal interactions involved, or for tourism, there may be a lot. All we really need for our framework to apply is that the gravity equation describes as interactions. And so you have more interactions at home where distances are low, fewer interactions abroad where distances are high, but you still have some interactions between those locations. That's all we really need, the disease dynamics from the SIR model combined with that gravity equation. But it's a great question.
Can I ask another question from Joshua Levy? It's an interesting question about, let's suppose we extend the model to 3 countries or 3 regions. And there's a travel ban between country A and B, but not between B and C. And essentially there's still some trickle down. Is your max operator you have used earlier, it's just the worst of the 3 still active? And how would travel bans between 2 countries affect the whole dynamics? Do you have anything to say on this?
Great question. So that result is actually a very, very general result. The key thing it relies on is that there's a degree of trade between the locations. So if in this 3-country example, as long as country A's travel ban is imperfect, so it's connected to some degree with one of the 2 countries, and as long as all countries are connected with one another, potentially indirectly, so for example, country C could be connected to country B, and country B is connected to country A, as long as there's a degree of connection between them, that result is still true, that what really drives the pandemic is the disease environment in the worst country. Of course, if country A can perfectly seal the border and can completely isolate itself from the other two countries, then it won't be affected. But that really relies on having kind of a perfect seal to be able to kind of contain all interactions. But yeah, great question.
So you would argue that there's no single island will be spared from the COVID crisis, de facto.
We would argue that it's really important to take these interactions between locations into account. And as I'm just about to sort of illustrate, I think that's sort of very evident in the US today, where we have parts of the US like New York and New Jersey, which were infected earlier in the pandemic and have implemented measures to control local infections. And then there are other parts of the country like North Dakota, further west, the Midwest, where infections are currently spiking. And what our kind of framework suggests is it's really important to take account of the fact that by people moving between states, there can be this transmission from these areas which are having these new spikes of infections. And so that is plausibly one reason why we sort of see this pattern of these multiple waves in the United States. It's not the only reason. That partly reflects the fact that the US is just the sum of those locations. But that sort of contagion between locations that are connected together is, I think, something that our framework suggests it's really important to take that into account. Of course, you want to have good policy locally anyway, but you want to take into account this potential to spread. And so that suggests that coordination between locations will be a good thing to try to kind of internalize those connections.
Josh here would like to know if, you have the people in North Dakota which do less social distancing compared to the people in New Jersey. Would it make a difference whether people in North Dakota would move to New Jersey and do less social distancing there? Or does it not even make a difference whether they move or not?
So great question. So the way we would think about that in our framework is that the two locations, New Jersey and North Dakota, potentially have different rates of disease transmission, this disease transmission parameter. It might be very high in North Dakota because people don't practice social distancing. It might be low in New Jersey because people practice social distancing. The way we've set things up is which we think is a sort of plausible, realistic way to set things up, is that when people from North Dakota travel to New Jersey, the chance they get infected depends upon the local transmission rate in New Jersey, where people have good practices. If people from North Dakota came to New Jersey and they changed the transmission rate because they started to behave as they do in North Dakota and not socially distanced, that would kind of make these interactions even worse than we're assuming here, because we assume that it's sort of the local environment in New Jersey that matters when people travel. So great question. So I should keep an eye on time. I'll just flag one more implication of our framework for how globalization is important for thinking about pandemics. And then I'll kind of zoom out to my bigger long run perspective. So, and it relates, this sort of final point about the interaction between globalization and pandemics relates to this question about multiple waves that we just heard earlier. So another insight of our framework is that in the basic model of disease dynamics, when you have a single closed country, as we saw earlier, you only ever have a single wave of infection if you have no lockdown policy. The only way you can have multiple waves is if the government introduces lockdowns. As soon as you bring globalization into the picture, it becomes possible to have multiple waves, even in the absence of any lockdowns or other government policies. And what's an easy way of seeing that? Well, think about a case where you have two countries trading. One of them has a disease environment where it has a very rapid epidemic if it's completely closed to trade and just left to itself. The other of the two countries has a disease environment where it has a much more slowly building epidemic. It takes a very long time to build up into a peak level of infections. Now I let these two countries trade with one another. What is going to happen? Well, a country that has this very rapid pandemic, it can now have multiple waves. It has its own first peak of infections driven by its own local rapidly building epidemic. And then it can have a second wave of infections driven by the more slowly building up epidemic in the second country. And this is particularly likely when this country, which has the rapid wave of infections in the closed economy, is small relative to the location that has this more slowly building wave of infections in the closed economy. And so a great example, very relevant for thinking about the US today, where you have interactions between states, you can have this multiple ways because of cross contagion between the different parts of the country. But I want to make sure I have a little bit of time for this sort of bigger picture story about the future of globalization. And so that's what I'm now going to zoom out to after kind of thinking about those interactions between globalization and the spread of infections. So what does this all mean for the future of globalization? Well, to begin with, I'm going to put it all into a little bit of a longer run perspective. And so here I'm going to draw on some of the work by my co-author, Paul Antras, that Markus highlighted earlier. So what has happened to globalization in recent decades? Well, as we all know, in the period since the Second World War, trade grew much more rapidly than world income. And so the ratio of trade to world GDP increased substantially between, and here I've shown this, between the early 1970s and the sort of the 2000 teens. Gradual secular increase in the ratio of trade to GDP, which we typically think of as an increase of globalization. Does COVID mean that this rising globalization is going to come to an end? Well, one point that I think is extremely important to take into account is something that Markus mentioned earlier, which is that when you look at this figure, it's not as if there was just a single constant rate of globalization that occurred during this entire post-Second World War period. In particular, the period between the mid-1980s and the early 2000s is a period of what's been referred to as hyperglobalization. It was a period of particularly rapid increases in globalization. Why is that the case? Well, there's a lot of evidence that was really driven by two things. The first of those things was policy liberalization. What kind of policy liberalizations? Well, it was partly multilateral trade liberalization under the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the GATT, which was the precursor to the World Trade Organization, and partly regional trade integration here in North America and the North American Free Trade Agreement, in Europe, the European Union. But importantly, it was policy liberalization in countries such as China, which in 1978 liberalized its economy and started to open up both domestically and internationally. And then also by the fall of the Iron Curtain in Europe in 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed and Europe again became integrated. And there's a lot of evidence that that led to increased global value chains in Europe and elsewhere as these locations that were previously closed became integrated into world markets. And then also importantly, this hyperglobalization was driven by new technologies, things like the invention of the computer, which started to disseminate widely in the 1980s, and then subsequent inventions such as the internet and email, which reduced communication costs and made it easier for firms to outsource and offshore stages of production away from countries like the United States to other lower cost locations such as China, Mexico, Vietnam, and other countries around the globe. And so this sort of, when you look at this figure, you see this recent apparent sort of slowdown in globalization. A lot of people have sort of concluded that means we're going to move into this phase of deglobalization. But that's a little bit misleading because we had this sort of truly exceptional period of hyperglobalization in the 1980s, which in part reflected events that are unlikely to repeat themselves, like China opening up, one-off events that were not sustainable. They couldn't continue indefinitely because China was going off through this once-off transition into the global economy. And it's not obvious that these technological improvements are going to continue in the same way leading into the future. So when thinking about the future of globalization, I think it's important to realize that this rapidly rising globalization was partly a kind of an exceptional period, an exceptional era. And it's sort of natural to think that globalization will slow almost of its own accord. And as Markus highlighted, that's led to this concept of snowballization that my co-author Paul has advertised, and that also Sumaya Keynes at The Economist has also advertised. Some things that are very interesting about this recent globalization, as we were just mentioning, were the growth of global value chains. You know, there have been other episodes in world history where countries have been highly connected between trade. That was particularly true, again, to connect back with Markus's opening comments. In the late 19th century, very early 20th century, countries were linked across the Atlantic through extensive trade. But one of the things that's very distinctive about trade in recent years has been this outsourcing and offshoring of stages of production, splitting up production stages and moving them across national boundaries. And one of the things, and you see that here, this is a growth of what's been referred to as global value chains trade. And so what does global value chains trade mean? This occurs whenever a good crosses multiple country boundaries during the course of its manufacture. So for example, a component might be produced in Japan, sent to China, assembled in China, and then sent to the US. And so along that course of that production chain, the good is crossing multiple country boundaries. And so this sort of shows that that period of hyperglobalization was driven by global value chains trade. And this recent slackening has been accompanied by a stagnation of the growth of global value chains trade. And again, I think that partly reflects this end of this exceptional period, but also potentially other kind of threats to globalization on the policy front, as I'm going to mention in a second. But I think it is important to sort of realize that, you know, it really is just a slackening here. It's not that we've seen this big drop in globalization, at least so far. It's really just a slowing of the rate of growth. And you see that not just for the ratio of trade to GDP, perhaps somewhat surprisingly against, you know, what might be some people's priors. You also see that if you look at the stock of migrants as a share of the world population. So these are United Nations estimates of the stock of migrants as a share of the world population. It's true that in recent years we've seen policy stances towards immigration tightening, most obviously here in the United States under the Trump administration. But if you just look at the current stock of migrants as a share of world population, it hasn't fallen dramatically, at least as of yet. If anything, there might just be a slowing of the rate of growth. And of course, this is partly influenced by the fact that at the same time as policy stances in some countries, such as the United States, have changed towards immigration, there have been other events pushing in other directions, such as the tragic events in Syria that led to increased migrant flows and increased the stock of migrants over the last few years. One area where you do see financial flows falling substantially is on flows of foreign direct investment and portfolio flows. So these are actually measures of financial flows, which have fallen quite a bit, mainly since the Great Recession of 2008. And I think an important part of the story here might be that the Great Recession was associated with a spike in uncertainty. And as uncertainty spikes, that tends to lead investors to become more cautious. And in particular, many of the responses to the Great Recession were sort of domestic bailouts, which may have made investments at home more attractive than in investments abroad, may have left investments abroad risky. And so I think that's an important part of this decline in financial flows. And of course, those financial flows might not be representative of real activity because they measure financial flows between locations. You might also be interested in measures of real foreign activity by multinational corporations. So in other words, what's often referred to as direct foreign investment, the operations of multinational firms. And so this figure zooms in on that measure here by looking at foreign affiliates shares of output as a share of global output. And you see some evidence that there is some evidence of decline there, even in those measures of real activity. So perhaps, you know, multinational corporations, foreign direct investment flows, there may be more evidence that that is starting to fall relative to that more general stagnation of globalization. So just in my last couple of minutes, just to try to draw things together, as Markus mentioned, perhaps one of the biggest threats to globalization is on the policy front. In recent years, under the Trump administration, not only has policy stance towards immigration changed, but we've seen dramatic changes in trade policy stance. In particular, during 2018, the Trump administration introduced 6 waves of tariffs at rates ranging from 10 to 50%, and those tariff increases continued through into 2019. There's a lot of evidence that those changes in trade policy have had quite a big impact on trade flows and on prices here in the United States. So these show you import weighted averages of prices for the 6 waves of goods that were subject to tariffs during 2018 in the United States, and the wave of goods that were not subject to tariffs. That's the dark line here called untreated. And you see that following the introduction of those waves of tariffs at time 0 is when those waves were introduced, you see quite sharp increases in import prices here in the United States, consistent with the idea that most of those tariffs have been passed through into prices here in the United States. And this is some evidence from work of myself and co-authors Mary Amiti and David Weinstein, but multiple authors have found the same thing. It's sort of very robust finding across many academic studies. And associated with those changes in trade policy stance, we see quite big declines in trade values. So perhaps the biggest threat to globalization is on the policy front. This just sort of also shows, connecting back with the first half of my talk, how has COVID-19 affected global trade? Will that be another threat on top of those policy threats to this longer term integration of the global economy? As Markus highlighted, in the early phases of the pandemic, there was evidence that trade relative to GDP fell. So trade fell even faster than production. And that's actually an implication of some of the parts of our theoretical analysis that I started the first part of our talk. But then, as Markus also highlighted, trade has recovered quite rapidly so far as economies have reopened. In the longer term, in my view, the biggest threat to COVID might be that if we don't get a vaccine and business travel is permanently restricted going forward. At the moment, it's quite feasible for us to sort of continue our existing trade relationships, but it might become increasingly difficult to form longer-term relationships if business travel is restricted. And so that might be a particular threat to the long-run trends in globalization. But so as not to keep people too long, so as to keep on track, I should probably try to draw together what I've talked about so far. So, there is evidence that globalization can make societies more vulnerable to pandemics, but it's kind of rich and subtle. That can actually go in both directions. But one of the key insights of our work is that these international connections between locations and connections domestically, like between North Dakota and New Jersey, really need to be taken into account when thinking about pandemics. When we place the current context in a longer term perspective, are we going into an era of deglobalization? At least so far, there's not a lot of evidence of that. Recent decades were instead a wave of exceptionally rapid increases in globalization, hyperglobalization. If anything, most of the evidence so far is for a process of snowballization. And that really, what was really true is we had exceptionally rapid growth, and so it's perhaps natural to expect things to slow down. Looking ahead, perhaps the biggest threats to globalization are actually policy threats, driven in part by political economy forces, as Markus highlighted, the growth in inequality. Many aspects of that may, in fact, be driven by technology, be driven by forces completely unrelated to globalization. And yet globalization can be a convenient source to point to as the driver of those trends, even if in actuality it is not. But those changes in policy stance may be some of the biggest threats to globalization, together with, if we don't get a vaccine soon and business travel is permanently curtailed, then our framework would suggest that would also lead to a longer term decline in trade. But I should stop there so as to keep on time. And sorry, Markus, I probably run a few minutes over.
No, that's fine. We always run a little bit longer. Thanks a lot, Steve. That was fantastic. A big picture view, COVID and trade, everything combined. There's still a lot of questions, and sorry for interrupting you, but it just shows that there was a lot of interest from the audience.
That's great. I'm happy to stay if you have time for a few questions. That would be terrific.
So a bunch of questions come with respect to social welfare. Mm-hmm. What should we do? So you pointed in the first part, you pointed out all the spillover effects, health externalities, essentially. Of course, trade also has some benefit. So can you put both together? Should we slow down the trade, or what should we do? Close the borders? Have you done some welfare analysis? Can you elaborate on the welfare analysis a little bit?
That's a great question. So that's often trade economists think of that as an optimal policy question. What is the sort of optimal policy in this scenario? That's not something we've actually studied in our paper so far, although I think it's something that our analysis suggests is a really, really interesting problem for somebody to study. So, how do trade economists typically think about this? Well, if a country is small relative to the world economy, at least at the aggregate level, trade economists would say that at the level of the aggregate economy, the best thing you could do from a purely trade policy point of view would be to have a free trade, because you sort of benefit from your interactions with other locations. The only exception to that can be what's called the terms of trade externality, where if you're a large country, potentially you can improve what's called your terms of trade by introducing a tariff. In other words, you can lower the prices received by the foreign country, the foreign exporters' prices, because you have some monopoly power if you're a large country. Although, in practice, whether you can achieve that is not very obvious, and at least the evidence I showed earlier for the recent US tariffs suggests there's very little change in foreign exporter prices. So it's not obvious in practice that you can do anything. And so there's firstly that kind of optimal trade policy question, which is present in our model and is something that's of interest. But then, as Markus highlighted, there's also this sort of epidemiological question that if trade is a conduit between disease, then there might be a case for using trade policy or other mobility frictions to limit interactions between locations. But our analysis suggests that's very subtle. There's no kind of one-size-fits-all policy, that sometimes globalization can exacerbate pandemics, other times it can actually help reduce the severity of the pandemic. It depends upon how different the countries that are trading with one another are in terms of their levels of infections. And there's a part of our paper that I didn't have too much time to talk about, but I really just want to sort of flag, would recommend to people if they're interested in this. In one part of our paper, we also point out that individuals individually, when there is a pandemic, they can change their behavior. They can change that alpha parameter that featured in my earlier slides. And so we actually study that, where individuals privately optimally choose whether to socially distance and how intensely to socially distance. And that further interacts with the optimal policy question, because when individuals make their choices, they're obviously thinking about their individual welfare. But because in these kind of models of disease interaction, when I go out into the world, I not only expose myself to infection, but if I'm infected and I'm asymptomatic, I also expose others to infection. And that's what economists term an externality, because my behavior affects them and I don't take it into account. And so again, that would create a potential scope for policy intervention. So actually, there is a really interesting optimal policy problem here, because there are these externalities and they're not obvious. They actually depend in very complicated ways on how uneven the two locations are in terms of the extent of infections. And so if anyone's interested in pursuing that problem, I think it's absolutely fascinating. And it's one for which our framework has implications. And at least so far, it's something that we haven't really talked between ourselves about pursuing.
I was wondering whether, you have this discontinuity result in a sense that, if you open up a little bit, you're already exposed to the virus.
Mm-hmm.
So you could make a very radical thing. I'm closing my country down altogether and all trade is gone. I open up a little bit. Do I push the discontinuity results too hard?
So great question. So in principle, if you could be absolutely sure of closing your borders to all kinds of interactions, that would be the way of isolating yourself from the pandemic. And in many ways, we might think of New Zealand as being kind of pretty close to that case. It was very successful with its domestic policies at eliminating the local infections, and it really limited international infections. But then, as we saw in the New Zealand case, it's actually very, very hard to achieve that. You just need one person to come to get there somehow through smuggling or through some other route, or some indirect movement for a third country that didn't itself have infections, and the epidemic can take off again. Furthermore, if you really do close your borders, that's obviously going to impose quite a strong economic cost in terms of lost opportunities to trade with other countries. And at least at the aggregate level, trade economists estimate that those welfare gains are substantial. So for example, for the US, the benchmark number people will talk about is 2 to 8% of GDP is the size of the aggregate gain to the US economy as a whole. Of course, some groups within the United States may be harmed by trade, others may benefit, but in the aggregate for the US economy as a whole, it's roughly 2 to 8% of GDP. So even if you could be sure you really definitely could close the border, there might be quite a big economic cost associated with that at the aggregate level.
Can I come back to the wave analysis you had as well? Your waves was essentially where herd immunity kicks in. That's where the peak is.
Mm-hmm.
But if I think of the waves we are facing, it's much more about behavioral changes, or seasonal patterns. The people do social distancing. At some point, they get tired of it and become more relaxed. Then the second wave kicks in. Can you capture this somehow too? So we really close down the border for a while, and then later on, we really need the goods from China, and then we open up again, and then the second wave kicks in. Can you enrich the model in this light as well? Because we don't really have reached herd immunity at this stage.
So great question. So we actually I sort of skipped over it for time reasons, because I also wanted to connect with the bigger picture analysis you mentioned. But we have a part of our paper where we really study those individual level behavioral responses to socially distance. So, and we actually consider the case where there's no government lockdown, but people individually can socially distance. And it's actually really rich. And I'll just sort of flag an example of how rich it is here. So imagine you have sort of two countries with different mortality rates. So country one has a relatively low mortality rate. Because country one has a low mortality rate, when people socially distance, they're much less aggressive. The behavioral responses are much less aggressive in country one, because people think that, well, there's much lower threat of death in country one. And so I'm going to keep my interactions because I'm not at such a high risk of becoming infected. But actually what that means is, because there's relatively little social distancing in country one, you get a very big peak of initial infections, a very high wave of initial infections. And then what does that mean? Well, people in country two, once they see this peak of infections and hence deaths in country one, even with a low mortality rate, there'll still be deaths as a result of those infections. People in country two won't want to go to country one because they know there's a lot of infections there. And so they'll socially distance. And so in our model, that actually reduces trade. and it causes the relative wage of country 1 to fall relative to country 2 because it refrains from interactions. So our framework has these sort of really subtle implications of those behavioral responses. And again, connecting with the government policy here, I think it would be super interesting to bring government policy into this framework and think about optimal policy. And as Markus highlighted, this would then interact with those multiple ways, because these behavioral responses will sort of influence the extent to which you see those multiple ways. And that's not something that we've extensively explored in our framework, but potentially we could push that further, and it would be a really interesting suggestion to explore that further.
I have one yes or no question quickly by Charles Yepes. Is it the case in your model that the second wave is always smaller than the first one?
I don't think we have a general prediction on that. It's really going to depend on a lot of things, like the differences in the transmission rate and the recovery rate in the two countries. There's going to be a generic force in the model that makes the second wave tend to be smaller, which is that because you've had the first wave, some people have got immunity, and so that will tend to be a force that makes the second wave smaller. That's true, but I wouldn't claim a theoretical result that it's necessarily has to be smaller, because I think it's going to depend on things like the number of countries, the transmission rate in each of the countries around the world, how symmetric, how different they are from one another in terms of their disease environment and their sizes. So there will be a force that tends to push in that direction, but I don't think it's necessarily the case.
So I wasn't able to get all questions through to you, sorry, but I throw one last question at you, and then we typically end up with a positive note. So if you have a positive message to the audience from your analysis, please let us know. But my question is, we had very low inflation of the last few decades, and one major reason was that, imports, there was essentially the whole Chinese labor force was helping out and keeping prices low. And do you think if we get this globalization, that this alone would actually lift inflation rates up? Do you have any predictions? It's a big picture question, but what's your take on that? And then the positive note, perhaps that's your positive note, that inflation will not go up or not too much, or if you have any other points, positive points.
Great questions. I think the question about inflation is very interesting on many dimensions. In particular, one aspect of it is interesting is I think also on inequality. So having some sort of studies of inflation during the pandemic, and in particular, those studies tend to suggest that the relative price increases have been much greater for individuals on lower income or less privileged groups. And so there could be a lot of heterogeneity throughout the population in terms of the extent to which prices rise.
That's not positive.
Yeah, that's not positive. I also will come to my end positive note. I mean, one thing our framework suggests is when you sort of measure inflation, one of the things you need to take into account is not just the price of the things you do buy, but the range of things you have access to. And I think one of the things we sort of forget during the pandemic is, we're used to being able to go out to coffee shops, to restaurants, to bars, to theaters, to movies and so on. And one of the implications of social distancing is it reduces the variety of things that you can do and the variety of goods and services that you can enjoy. And if you actually think about it, that's a form of inflation, because it reduces your welfare, that you're losing access. It's as if the sort of price of your stream of consumption services has gone up because you can't do all these things you could do before. And so I think that's a part of the inflation debate that's missed. And, related to globalization, if we limit trade with China and other countries with lower costs, ultimately that will show up in higher prices or a reduced variety of goods and services, which in a way is like a form of higher prices. Yeah. But to end on a positive note, obviously this news about a new vaccine that looks extremely promising is quite positive. And one of the things we actually find in our framework is that once the pandemic is over, in the absence of changes in policy, like new tariffs and so on, globalization rebounds very quickly. And so actually our framework is quite optimistic for a V-shaped recovery. Even in the presence of adjustment costs, we find that things bounce back quite quickly. And so that does actually end on a very positive note.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Stephen, for putting epidemic studies and trade together. I think it's a fascinating project.
Thank you very much for the invitation again, and for all the great questions. It was really fun. It was a lot of fun to debate these really important questions today.
Great. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Okay. And I see you around. Probably
see you hopefully in person soon.
Okay.
Bye.